Bonjour! What if I told you that for a brief moment, the United States nearly annexed most of Canada, from Hudson Bay south to Manitoba and west to the Pacific Ocean? What if I told you that a handful of Métis fur traders, ox cart drivers, and Red River settlers, led by one man, nearly formed their own nation and did forge their own province briefly? Welcome to today's installment of This Day in Minnesota History. Let's title this episode, A Simple Guest in His Own Country. I give you an article from the September 17th, 1885 edition of the Zumbro Times. Grover Cleveland serves as U.S. President in 1885. Good Housekeeping magazine goes on sale for the first time, and the Statue of Liberty arrived in New York Harbor. On September 15th, a train wreck in Ontario kills Jumbo the elephant in the P.T. Barnum circus train. In Minnesota, St. Thomas Academy is founded. Today's article details the end of an appeals process for a trial that began on July 20th, far off in Regina, Canada. Yes, that's how you pronounce that. Take note. It somberly concludes that sentencing is to take place on September 18th and that a death sentence is expected. To understand why this article should be picked up by a little southern Minnesota newspaper, we need to back up and understand the fur trade a little bit. Let's start with 1670 and the founding of the Hudson Bay Company, the oldest existing commercial enterprise on the planet. It still has stores open today. The company was incorporated by English royal charter in 1670 as the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading in Hudson's Bay. When granted the English royal charter in 1670 by King Charles II of England after the Civil War, the Hudson's Bay Company, under the governorship of the king's cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was granted the sole trade and commerce of all those seas, straits, bays, rivers, lakes, creeks, and sound, in whatsoever latitude they shall be, that lie within the entrance of the straits commonly called Hudson's Straits, together with all the lands, countries, and territories upon the coasts and confines of the seas, straits, bays, lakes, rivers, creeks, and sounds aforesaid, which are not now actually possessed by any of our subjects, or by the subjects of any other Christian prince or state, and that the said land be from henceforth reckoned and reputed as one of our plantations or colonies in America, called Rupert's Land. The company, over the course of time, expanded the definition of its territory to include most of west central Canada, all the way to the Rockies, including the Red River Valley. They constituted not only the main financial enterprise of the region, but also its only Western white government. The fur trade dominated the Great Lakes region and what is now central and western Canada for many years, until at least the 1840s. It did not end then, but it ceased to be the main European interest. By that time, fashions had changed, the animals had been hunted nearly to extinction, settlers arrived, and an entirely new culture had evolved, the Métis. Métis is a French word that means mixed. In Canada, it is a proper noun, describing a distinct culture with its own language, customs, and history. See, the voyageurs, those stalwart French Catholic adventurers who were the mainstay of the French, English, and American fur trade, never left the area. They never left Minnesota. They often married into Native American tribes, many of them taking this responsibility seriously. Over the course of time, these people were perceived as being neither European nor Indian. Métis people contributed a great deal to Minnesota history. Aside from all the other things, I'll just give you a few. Little Canada is called Little Canada because Métis settled there. Louis Robert also known as Louis Robert, a Métis trader and later a steamboat captain, contributed his name to Robert Street in St. Paul. Most anyone with a French name in Minnesota probably traces back to Métis people. Many of them, in fact thousands of them, settled in the Red River Valley, along western Minnesota and all the way up to Fort Garry, what is now Winnipeg. Their main settlement was at Pembina, for a brief time a part of Minnesota and now the northeastern tip of North Dakota. Here the Métis hunted for furs, primarily bison. They built wooden carts pulled by oxen and brought these furs to St. Paul, traveling a 40-day one-way voyage over a series of trails across Minnesota. Depending on tribal wars or weather, they would choose one trail or the other. There were as many as, well, there were three main ones. Moving along, Louis Riel was born in 1844 in St. Boniface, near what is now Winnipeg. Unlike many Métis boys, he had a more privileged upbringing, eventually being sent east to study for the priesthood. He was an excellent student, but when his father died in 1864, his attitude changed, and in 1865 he was asked to leave the college. Louis was not a traditional Métis man. He did not hunt, reportedly could not shoot well, did not ride as if born to the saddle, did not drink, and showed very little interest in women. He did not marry until he was 40 years of age. But returning to the Red River Valley, he found his old home stirring with newly discovered nationalism. There was no government in this part of the world yet, not at least in the way white people knew it. Oh, Minnesota was a territory by then, and in 58 was a state, but St. Paul was a very long ways away. Canadian government did not extend that far west yet either. Canada was essentially Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. That was it. Their only government in this part of the world was the Hudson Bay Company. Now and again, the company would form a court or send a regional governor to various places to ensure that their trade continued, but that was about it. And they had the audacity to assert that people should only trade with them and no other. Well, see, the Canadian-US border existed, but it existed really theoretically. Métis people, who called themselves the gens libres, the free men, free in the sense of having no rulers, but also in the sense of desiring free trade, took it upon themselves to go north or south as the prophet dictated. By the 1850s, the Métis had forced Hudson Bay to concede them a political role in governing the area, as well as property rights, especially in the Red River Valley and the Fort Garry area. We're talking mostly Winnipeg, but since the Métis did not necessarily understand or care much about the border, these rights were felt on the U.S. side as well. Moving ahead to 1869, three things happen. First, the Hudson Bay Company agrees to sell their charter to Canada, thus setting the stage to establish a new province or provinces. Second, settlers begin to trickle in. The third thing was that basically nobody bothered to ask the Métis people what they thought, nor were they included in any discussions about what was essentially their land. Louis Riel came into this foment, and very quickly, because of his sharp mind, his passionate identity as a Métis, and newly discovered organizational qualities, found himself put forth as the leader of the Métis community. They began their resistance by halting surveying teams sent west by the Canadian government. Now, this was of great import to the Métis because these people were surveying the land according to Eastern principles and not Métis principles. Métis principles established long, thin properties, each of which abutted the Red River, ensuring that all of their animals had access to water. Eastern principles of surveying set up large square blocks of property arranged like a checkerboard. Now, this would have destroyed existing property ownership among the Métis, and it also would have sent into chaos water rights for livestock. Canada responds to this by sending a man named William McDougall, the Lieutenant Governor of Rupert's Land, out to take possession of the Northwest Territories, of which Rupert's Land was a part. He brought with him a small government as well as 300 rifles. The Métis responded by electing Riel the secretary of the Métis National Committee. They blocked McDougall from entering. Eventually, Riel and the Métis took control of Fort Garry. And by December of '69, they created a provisional government in defiance of McDougall, who even resorted to forging a royal proclamation giving him authority over the territory. On our side of the border, the U.S. side, imagine how this looked. Canada, specifically British Canada, was a country with which we had not established a good relationship quite yet. Not only were there still hard feelings with Britain, there was the matter of the Revolution and the War of 1812, but the U.S. now had uncounted thousands of Irish citizens who had no love for Britain and who voted. The U.S. continued to expand westward, and under its policy of manifest destiny, could only see this as an opportunity. The border was fluid. Métis living in the U.S. aided those at Fort Garry. A number of U.S. businessmen and politicians, men like Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, who was a Minnesota congressman and businessman, Enos Stutzman, who was a trader and politician from Minnesota, kept tabs on the doings up north. They made trips to Pembina. They wrote things back to the St. Paul Daily Press and other newspapers. For all intents and purposes, they spied. They sent letters back to the government in St. Paul, in Washington. They sent letters to the State Department and President Grant. They raised money, at least $500,000 in St. Paul, to aid Louis Riel's effort. They worried about British Canada's intention to send troops. Indeed, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1873 was founded specifically to help keep order in this part of the world. In short and in specific, as Donnelly said to the St. Paul Daily Press, quote, "Such a state of feeling should be aroused in the nation as will prevent General Grant from giving permission to the red-coated soldiers of England to cross the soil of our state to reduce to subjugation men whose aspirations are for liberty and whose entire sympathies are with the American people. If the revolutionists of Red River are encouraged and sustained by the avowed sympathy of the American people, we may within a few years, perhaps months, see the stars and stripes wave from Fort Garry, from the waters of Puget Sound, and along the shores of Vancouver." A further complication was that Minnesota did not want to see fighting break out between white people and Native Americans because they still lived in the shadow of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Now, I could spend hours, days, speaking about this situation that so very few Minnesotans know about it. First of all, it's fascinating. Second of all, there's a lot of information. But in the interests of time, I feel compelled to sum up. The U.S. was unable to effect aid to such a far-flung place. There were no railroads. There was no way to get people or supplies that far out into the hinterlands. It took over a month. These efforts, though enthusiastically embraced, came to nothing. Louis Riel and the Métis made progress at first. The Manitoba Act of 1870 passed in Canada, which established the province and guaranteed Métis rights. But during 1869, a handful of British loyalists had attempted to take up arms against the Métis in Fort Garry and overthrow Riel, trying to retake the town. They were thwarted and held in prison. One of this band, a man named Thomas Scott, was sentenced by a Métis court 5-2 and sentenced to death by firing squad. When Canadian British troops arrived, They immediately began hunting for Riel, intending to hold him for executing Scott, an act which the soldiers saw as murder. Riel fled with a number of other Métis leaders. Even though he was even eventually elected to Parliament, Riel was unable to take his seat for fear of reprisals or arrest. He was eventually granted amnesty in 1875 by new Prime Minister Mackenzie, but was ordered to stay in exile for 5 years. So Louis Riel lived and traveled around the U.S., eventually became a citizen of the United States, primarily moving back and forth from St. Paul to Pembina, and spent some time with the Métis out in Montana. Homesick, he returned in 1884 when his exile was over. He was asked to lead the Métis again. Settlers had been pouring in. Métis rights were being ignored. Their traditional ways of life were disappearing in the face of this overwhelming change. Riel helped draw up a petition asking for new provinces to be established that would exist for Métis people. But times were hard. 1885 brought hardship, disease, starvation, and anger and impatience. There was fighting. The military stepped in. Riel eventually surrendered and was charged with treason. The trial took place on July 20th, 1885. The jury was 6 white English Protestant lawyers who spoke only English. Riel spoke primarily French, some Cree, as well as some English. The lawyers were not permitted to speak of Métis grievances. Riel's lawyers wanted to plead insanity. Riel was so vehemently opposed to this tactic that the judge ruled Riel did not have permission to speak during his own trial. On July 31st, after an hour of deliberation, Riel was pronounced guilty. On September 17th, his final appeal failed, and he was sentenced to death, a sentence carried out on November 16th of 1885. I'll finish by leaving you a few of Riel's last words to the court. Although I am simply a guest of this country, a guest of the half-breeds of the Saskatchewan, although as a simple guest I work to better the condition of the people of Saskatchewan at the risk of my life, to better the condition of the people of the Saskatchewan at the risk of my life, to better the condition of the people of the Northwest, I have never had any pay. It has always been my hope to have a fair living wage one day. It will be for you to pronounce. If you say I was right, you can conscientiously acquit me, as I hope, through the help of God you will. You will console those who have been 15 years around me, only partaking in my sufferings. What you will do in justice to me, in justice to my family, in justice to my friends, in justice to the Northwest, will be rendered 100 times to you in this world. And to use a sacred expression, life everlasting in the other. All right, I'm going to attempt to do a couple of Métis tunes. I've learned a few. I don't know them terribly well because I don't get to perform them, so it's hard to keep up on the practice. But the first one is a tune called Jimmy Callahoo's Special, if I recall, and the second is The Drops of Brandy. Métis culture, over the course of hundreds of years, developed their own body of fiddle tunes, distinct from Irish, Scots, French, but incorporating aspects of all of those cultures as well as Native American musics. Somebody once told me, because these tunes wind up being crooked, aka they don't fit the 8-bar fiddle tune standards, that the only effective way to count them is to count one and. May be true for some of the tunes. It's funny regardless if you're a fiddle tune geek like I am. Well, let's give them a shot. First one's Jimmy Callahoo's Special. Thanks very much for stopping in. We'll see you again in a week. Bye.